On the 20th of May of 1941, over Crete, hundreds of German planes covered the sky. Bombers, gliders, and thousands of paratroopers descended on an island defended by some 57,000 Allied soldiers and a civilian population ready to fight. Thus began Operation Mercury, the largest aerial invasion undertaken until then by Germany. For days, Maleme, Chania, Rethymno, and Heraklion remained under constant fire. Entire villages were destroyed and the roads were covered with corpses. Germany took the island, but lost so many men that Adolf Hitler never again authorized such an offensive. What did the Nazis do in Crete so that thousands disappeared without a trace? Crete, the paradise that Hitler condemned. In 1940, Greece tried to remain neutral while Italy pressed from Albania, occupied since 1939. Athens avoided provoking Rome, even after the sinking of the cruiser Helle. Neutrality was a survival maneuver. Benito Mussolini chose Greece as a target. On the 28th of October of 1940, Italy presented an ultimatum while its troops were already crossing from Albania. Metaxas rejected it, the famous no, and the country mobilized immediately. Italy expected a brief campaign. It failed. Its forces advanced poorly prepared, were halted in the mountains, and suffered serious logistical problems. Greece took advantage of the terrain, while the population helped transport supplies through impossible routes. The Italian momentum broke and Greece went on the counterattack, pushing the enemy back toward Albania in the middle of winter. Many casualties occurred due to cold and exhaustion, but the advance continued. For London, Greece was becoming the first country to push back an Axis army. Thousands of men from the 5th Cretan Division were sent to the mainland to fight in Albania. They gained a reputation as tough and effective troops, but while they fought far from home, Crete became increasingly exposed. The Italian defeat altered Berlin's calculations. Hitler did not see Greece as a priority, but the conflict threatened the German southern flank. The British presence could compromise eastern Mediterranean routes and bring enemy bombers closer to the Ploesti oil fields. The Italian adventure had become a strategic problem for the Reich. Since May of 1940, some British figures were already warning of the importance of Crete. Among them was John Pendlebury, an archaeologist and profound expert on the island due to his work in Knossos. Sent to Greece by British intelligence structures linked to the MIR, Pendlebury managed to enter the country when other agents were rejected by the Greek authorities, who still defended neutrality. He immediately crossed to Crete and began to contact old acquaintances in villages and mountains. While in Europe, many looked at general maps. He knew every valley, port, and gorge of the island. Pendlebury understood something essential. Whoever dominated Crete would control a central piece of the eastern Mediterranean. From its ports, especially Ceuta Bay, naval forces capable of monitoring the Aegean and the routes to Egypt could operate. From its airfields, aviation could project over mainland Greece, Libya, or the open sea. The island was situated between 3 decisive theaters: the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East. With Greek approval, Cunningham prepared Ceuta Bay for the Royal Navy, and new British troops arrived to protect the base. The arrival of those forces allowed the Greek government to transfer the 5th Cretan Division to the continental front. But the decision left Crete without a large part of its most experienced fighters just before the German attack. At the beginning of 1941, Hitler made the final decision. On the 5th of December of 1940, he had already resolved to prepare the invasion of the Soviet Union. To execute that plan, he needed to secure the Balkans first. The planned operation against Greece, called Marita, went from being a secondary option to an immediate necessity. If Great Britain consolidated itself in Greece and Crete, Germany would have a threat in its southern rear just before launching toward the east. Greece had to fall. However, in Athens, they were still trying to gain time. Metaxas resisted accepting small British forces that could not stop Germany, but would provoke its attack. He wanted sufficient help, or none at all. His military calculation was clear. A symbolic presence would be useless. The problem was that Greece was already fighting exhausted in Albania, with exhausted men, worn-out material, and limited reserves. At the end of January of 1941, the death of Metaxas from throat cancer left the country without the leader who had maintained that line of prudence. His successor, Alexandros Korizis, showed a greater willingness to receive British support. Churchill interpreted the occasion as the possibility of building a Balkan front together with Greece, Yugoslavia, and Turkey. Diplomatic and military missions were sent to Athens. On paper, the alliance could seem powerful. In practice, it depended on poorly equipped armies, slow decisions, and governments subjected to enormous German pressures. While figures and plans were discussed, the Reich's divisions were already concentrating in Romania and Bulgaria. The situation of Crete became more delicate every week. The island had British troops, growing naval facilities, and a population hostile to the Axis. It also possessed a symbolic value. It remained free while the Balkan continent tilted toward total war. Pendlebury traveled through villages, spoke with local notables, and evaluated possible resistance groups. He believed that, with sufficient weapons, the Cretans could turn the mountains into a trap for any invader. But the weapons did not arrive at the necessary pace. In February and March of 1941, while Greece continued fighting Italy, the main danger no longer came from Albania, but from the north. Bulgaria approached the Tripartite Pact and opened the way for the German deployment. The Greek high commands discussed whether to defend Thrace and eastern Macedonia or retreat toward more solid lines in the interior. Each delay consumed a time that no longer existed. For Crete, the situation was even worse. British and Germans considered it indispensable, and the island was about to be isolated. Invasion. The death that fell from the sky. When the survivors evacuated from Greece spotted the White Mountains on the horizon, Crete appeared as a refuge. Most of the transports entered Suda Bay. However, the arrival did not convey security. There were sunken hulls, damaged vessels, and the cruiser HMS York, semi-submerged after an Italian attack. The bombed pier showed from the first moment that Crete was already under constant fire. On the 25th of April, 4 battalions of the 2nd New Zealand Division arrived. They disembarked exhausted after the retreat from Greece. A British officer ordered to pile up every weapon except rifles and pistols. Brigadier James Hargest refused, convinced that the equipment would not be returned. Despite his protest, many companies lost heavy weaponry. The scene left a bitter impression among British and Commonwealth troops. In a few days, nearly 27,000 men were dispersed between Suda and Chania. They settled in olive groves and hillsides. Rations were poor and bread was missing. Cretan hospitality contrasted with a deficient organization. Chania and its surroundings became saturated. Along with formed troops, airmen without planes, mechanics without tools, and stragglers of all kinds appeared. Also, civilians fleeing toward Egypt. The Greek royal family and the provisional government arrived on the island, although their presence generated coldness. King George carried the discredit of having legitimized the Metaxas dictatorship, and many Cretans remembered that their weapons had been confiscated years before. Now they faced an invasion, almost unarmed. Crete combined coastal cities and an austere, mountainous interior. Pride, hospitality, and the memory of resistance remained alive. That identity would be decisive in the following days. Meanwhile, in Berlin and Athens, the German operation was being prepared. British dominance of the sea made a conventional landing risky, so only an aerial offensive seemed viable. Kurt Student convinced Hitler and Göring to launch Operation Merkur. The plan would attack Maleme, Chania Suda, Rethymno, and Heraklion with paratroopers and airborne reinforcements. The aerial concentration was immense. More than 500 Junkers, 52 gathered at airfields in mainland Greece. To them were added Stukas, Ju-88, Dorniers, Heinkels, and Messerschmitt fighters. However, German intelligence committed serious errors. It calculated that the British garrison in Crete barely reached 5,000 men, that there were no troops in Rethymno, and that the civilian population would receive the invaders with enthusiasm. A pro-German fifth column was even expected. None of that was true. On the island, there were much more numerous British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek forces, in addition to a population determined to fight. On the 29th of April, General Bernard Freyberg, a New Zealand hero of the First World War, arrived to assume command of the defense. He received secret intelligence coming from the decryption of German communications, although he believed it came from spies. That information revealed that a large airborne attack was approaching. Even so, Freyberg interpreted that the main danger would be a maritime invasion. That conclusion conditioned the defensive deployment, reserves away from Malem, lines extended toward the coast, and attention divided between sea and air. The main threat was in the skies. At dawn on the 20th of May of 1941, the assault began. Waves of Junkers 52 loaded with Fallschirmjäger took off from Athens. Gliders advanced ahead to attack anti-aircraft batteries and key positions. At dawn, over Maleme and Chania, the sky was filled with engines. Bombers struck first. Then the black silhouettes of the transports appeared. From the ground, many defenders saw hundreds of white parachutes open while red, green, and yellow containers with weapons and supplies fell. Crete was entering a form of war that no front had seen on that scale. In Malem, the New Zealanders of the 22nd Battalion fired at the men suspended in the air. Officers ordered to aim at the boots to better calculate the fall. Dozens of paratroopers were left hanging lifeless or crashed upon touching the ground. The gliders landed in the stony bed of the Tavronitis River under intense fire. Some were smashed to pieces, others were immobilized. Even so, German units managed to regroup and advance toward the runway and Hill 107, the dominant point of the airfield. The combat became immediate and brutal. In the Aya Valley and around Galatas, the same thing happened. German troops descended on well-hidden New Zealand positions and suffered enormous losses. The 19th Battalion claimed to have shot down 155 paratroopers and captured only 9 prisoners. Greek units, initially poorly armed, resisted more firmly than expected. Even battered or improvised forces reacted with unexpected violence. The British understood within hours that the battle would not follow conventional patterns. The greatest surprise for Germany was the civilian population. Peasants, old men, women, boys, and priests came out with shotguns, knives, axes, or agricultural tools. In Perivolia, isolated paratroopers were shot down by neighbors armed with hoes and pickaxes. In Alikianu, irregulars attacked the German rear. Priests led groups of volunteers and some monks fought with captured rifles. For the German commanders, that popular resistance was scandalous and infuriating. In Castelli-Kisamu, a German detachment of 72 men was confronted by the 1st Greek Regiment and Cretan civilians. More than 50 Germans died, and the rest were taken prisoner. At the end of the first day, 1,856 German paratroopers had died. The real figure probably exceeded 2,000. Even so, Germany continued fighting and concentrated all its efforts on opening a breach toward the airfields of the West. Airfield, the era that killed the island. On the 20th of May, while the first German drops were falling over Crete, the decisive area was in Malem. There was the airfield whose possession could decide the campaign. Colonel Andrew, in command of the 22nd New Zealand Battalion, lost contact with headquarters from the early hours and also with his forward companies next to the runway. Without radios and with limited visibility among olive groves and hollows, he fought practically blind while the paratroopers continued descending. The defense covered broken ground full of dead zones. Observation posts could not transmit reports, and enemy aviation prevented sending messengers. Some positions resisted with very few men against new German waves that were probing the runway. Toward mid-morning, German forces began to infiltrate the edge of the field. Captain Johnson asked for support from 2 Matilda tanks, but Andrew preferred to hold them in reserve. Shortly after, the Germans occupied the RAF camp, captured documents, and used prisoners as human shields toward Hill 107. Confusion increased. RAF and Fleet Air Arm personnel fought as infantry. Andrew knew he had caused casualties to the enemy, but he did not know how many men were still entering the area. Without reliable reports, every movement seemed a greater threat than it really was. Andrew asked for help repeatedly during the day. Communications failed, and brigade headquarters did not react. Lightly wounded, and with mortar grenades falling around his post, Andrew asked for support again at 5 in the afternoon. Hargest responded that the 23rd Battalion was busy fighting paratroopers, a claim that was not true. Faced with the refusal, Andrew finally decided to use his winning card. The 2 Matildas and a reserve platoon reinforced with volunteer gunners. The tanks advanced toward the Tavronitis, but one carried incorrect ammunition, and its turret barely turned. It returned. The other descended into the riverbed, got stuck on a rock, and also had its turret disabled. The infantry escort was repulsed with losses. At 6 in the afternoon, Andrew reported the failure and warned that without support from the 23rd Battalion, he would have to withdraw. Hargest responded with a phrase that would mark the battle. "If you must, you must." He added that he would send 2 companies. Andrew believed they would arrive immediately. They did not appear. At nightfall, without abundant ammunition, without news from his forward companies, and convinced that the runway was lost, he began to consider a complete withdrawal. However, the reality on the front line was different. If Andrew had advanced to observe the coastal strip and the western slope of Hill 107, he would have seen that Captain Johnson's C Company was still resisting strongly over the airfield, and that Campbell's D Company was holding its positions over the Tavronitis. They had suffered casualties, but they had also shredded the attackers and did not intend to withdraw. The British command was acting under a false image of defeat precisely when the line was still holding. Shortly after 9 at night, Andrew notified by radio that he would fall back to a secondary ridge southeast of Hill 107. Hargest did not react. He even informed divisional headquarters that the situation in Malem was quite satisfactory. Runners were sent to warn the forward companies, but they did not reach either C or D or the headquarters next to Pyrgos. A Maori company and another from the 23rd Battalion were sent late and without coordination. The Maoris arrived in the dark to within about 200 meters of C Company's command post, heard German voices, assumed all was lost, and returned. The forward units knew nothing of the general retreat. In some trenches, ammunition was missing. In others, the men remained almost intact. Captain Campbell, on the slope of the Tavronitis, only believed the news when he personally verified that the battalion headquarters had disappeared. Then he also fell back. On the runway, C Company remained alert all night, listening to enemy voices around them. Captain Johnson understood that his men could prevent landings, but at dawn they would be targets for Stukas, Messerschmitts, and new troops, without hope of reinforcement. At 4:20 in the morning, he ordered a silent evacuation. The soldiers moved barefoot among groups of sleeping paratroopers and managed to reunite with the 21st Battalion. At dawn on the 21st of May, no New Zealand troops remained within the perimeter of the airfield. From the new positions, they could only hit the eastern end of the runway with direct fire. Maleme was lost before starting the second day. Putik and Freiburg had been deceived by Hargest's report and by errors of judgment that kept them indecisive at the decisive moment. While they hesitated, General Student made the opposite decision, to risk everything at Maleme. First thing in the morning, Captain Clay verified that the western part of the field was free of direct fire. Student ordered the transfer of the 5th Mountain Division from Tanagra. That afternoon, the 1st Junkers 52 began to land with troops from the 100th Mountain Regiment. Although many aircraft were hit by British artillery, the Germans kept the runway operational, removed damaged planes, and forced prisoners to repair craters under threat of death. The constant flow of transports impressed even the Allied officers in Kriforce. In barely 70 seconds, a plane landed, unloaded, and took off. Only then did they accept the need to counterattack Malem. But the force assigned was insufficient against an already reinforced position. While the British were still reorganizing, the Germans were consolidating their aerial bridgehead. The Allied retreat and the abandoned. On the night of the 21st of May, while counterattacks were still being discussed in Allied headquarters, another decisive battle was being fought at sea. British commanders believed a landing at Chania was imminent, but the German flotilla was advancing with reinforcements and ammunition. That confusion kept troops away from Malem and would end up costing the island. The German naval force was improvised and vulnerable. Small Greek wooden boats, called kayaks, old steamers, and Italian escorts, prepared as support if the airfields were rendered useless. The Royal Navy dominated the surface of the Mediterranean, although without air cover. Every operation implied enormous risks. Even so, Cunningham ordered to sweep the sea every night to prevent any transport from reaching Crete. Hours later, the British located the convoy. Their cruisers advanced in the darkness and turned searchlights on the flotilla. The Italian destroyer Lupo charged, launching torpedoes to cover the transports, but came under much superior fire. Then the destruction of the convoy began. The kayaks, made of wood and without protection, were trapped under cannons and machine guns. Some soldiers threw themselves into the sea, while others tried to surrender. At dawn, most of the vessels were sunk or scattered. In Kriforce, Freiberg believed he had frustrated the main threat. Many officers went to sleep, convinced that the battle was almost resolved. When dawn broke on the 22nd of May, the opportunity to recover the airfield had almost been lost. The counterattack began late and clashed with paratroopers entrenched among vineyards, farmhouses, and improvised positions. Every minute lost favored the enemy. Lieutenant Charles Upham would remember almost continuous machine gun fire. Even so, the New Zealanders charged head-on and threw grenades at close range. There were heavy casualties on both sides. The Maoris also advanced hard until hitting solid defenses. 2 tanks were knocked out, one by a captured Bofors gun and another by mechanical failure. With dawn came the German fighters, strafing the troops exposed in open terrain. A company of the 20th Battalion managed to approach the eastern end of the airfield. Several damaged Junkers remained on the runway. It seemed possible to burst in, but Ramecke's paratroopers concentrated mortars and automatic weapons on the attackers. Without sufficient cover and under aerial attacks, the men fell back through high reed beds. A misinterpreted message ended up ordering a retreat to the starting line. The most serious opportunity to recover Malem closed there. The runway remained definitively in German hands. Even then, some Allied reports erroneously described a possible enemy evacuation. They spoke of planes landing and taking off, of fires on the field, and of apparent calm. The reality was the opposite. Every landing reinforced German dominance of the western sector of Crete. When the magnitude of the error was understood, there were no longer sufficient reserves to reverse the situation. That same 22nd of May, the Royal Navy suffered a devastating day. Cunningham insisted on preventing a second flotilla from reaching the island. Rear Admiral King penetrated dangerous waters again with 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers. They sank some kayaks, but remained under continuous aerial attack. The cruiser Naiad was damaged. The Carlisle took hits. Then new waves of bombers arrived. The situation worsened rapidly. The destroyer Greyhound was sunk. The cruisers Gloucester and Fiji, sent to cover rescues, were left exposed with low ammunition reserves. The Gloucester received several bombs and was lost with 722 sailors dead. Later, the Fiji was hit and capsized. Hundreds of survivors spent hours in the water until being picked up by the destroyers Kandahar and Kingston. In a single day, the British fleet lost 2 cruisers and a destroyer, while other large ships were damaged. German aerial superiority already made the naval presence near Crete unsustainable. The strategic balance broke. The Navy could dominate the night, but the Luftwaffe dominated the day. Without secure airfields on the island, that equation doomed any prolonged defense. In parallel, King George II and members of the government crossed the White Mountains toward the south coast, escorted by New Zealand troops. Finally, they reached Ai Rumeli, where British destroyers were preparing their evacuation. Even the Greek political apparatus was abandoning Crete before the final outcome. While the command tried to organize the retreat, entire units fell back toward Suda Bay and then toward the south coast. Others were isolated without transport or clear communications. They were no longer fighting to keep the island, but to escape from it. Nazi terror, executions, and villages erased from the map. After the end of the fighting, Crete entered a brief silence marked by confusion and rage. Many islanders did not understand the British retreat, or that they had been denied weaponry while fighting on their own. That frustration lasted little. The German presence quickly transformed discontent into open hatred toward the occupier. The Wehrmacht had just suffered on the island the most serious losses of its entire war up to that moment, and among its ranks, an immediate desire for revenge grew. For many commanders, the Cretan civilian resistance was more offensive than British military action. German paratroopers had been trained under a discipline that distinguished between regular soldiers and irregular combatants. In that logic, any armed peasant, old man with an ancient rifle, or neighbor who attacked from their village was considered an enemy without rights. That reaction provoked a deep resentment. Very soon, stories circulated about mutilations and attacks against German wounded. Many of those versions were exaggerated, others could never be proven, but they were enough to justify a policy of immediate terror. Hermann Göring ordered a judicial investigation and simultaneous reprisals. Before the military judges finished collecting testimonies, the executions had already begun. On the 31st of May, General Kurt Student issued an order that authorized shootings, collective fines, village burnings, and the extermination of the male population in areas considered hostile. He demanded absolute speed and the elimination of formalities. For the inhabitants of Crete, that meant that any report, suspicion, or simple accusation could end in a massacre without any process. Some German officers protested against those indiscriminate measures. Major Count von Uexküll, chief of staff of the paratrooper division, rejected the plan harshly. Others, like Colonel Bruno Breuer, ridiculed the most extreme rumors used to justify murders. However, there were also commanders willing to lead execution squads. The repressive machinery was already in motion and depended less on internal debates than on a clear political will to impose obedience through fear. One of the first episodes occurred in Condomari. There, about 60 civilians were lined up and shot. The execution was led by Lieutenant Horst Trebes, an officer hardened by combat. A German journalist, Franz Peter Weixler, photographed those scenes. Far from rewarding him, the authorities subjected him to a court-martial for later helping a Cretan escape. Even within the German apparatus, documenting certain crimes could become a crime. In Castelli Cisemu, where a German unit had suffered heavy casualties, German troops executed about 200 men based on accusations of mutilation of corpses. Subsequent investigations drastically reduced the verifiable cases, but the deaths had already been consummated. Other locations, such as Kakopetro, Floria, and Prases, also suffered collective punishments. German records themselves later recognized 698 executions of alleged irregular combatants, and another 180 men eliminated under special territorial extermination orders. On the 3rd of June, one of the most remembered symbols of the occupying terror arrived, Kandanos. The population had resisted the German advance toward the south coast. In response, the town was razed. Over the blackened ruins, the invaders placed a proclamation announcing that Kandanos had been destroyed in reprisal for the death of 25 German soldiers. It was not just military punishment, it was a message directed at the entire island. Each center of resistance could disappear from the map. The punitive expeditions continued during the summer. On the 1st of August, an operation south of Kania destroyed new villages, among them Alikianu, Fornes, and Skenes. In that action, 145 men and 2 women were shot, most of them from Fornes. By then, thousands of families lived among ruins, displacements, and disappearances. Many men hid in mountains or ravines to avoid raids. Others were simply seen for the last time being loaded into military trucks. Even ecclesiastical authorities tried to slow the spiral. Agathangelos Zirouhakis, Bishop of Kydonia and Apollonius, warned the new German commander, General Waldemar André, that the violence would only produce more blood on both sides. André seemed to understand, but decided first on a demonstration of force. That formula ended up being another repressive operation. On the 1st of September, about 2,000 mountain soldiers surrounded the Omelos Plain in the White Mountains. The incursion encountered limited resistance, but the improvised expeditionary courts condemned 110 men, among them 39 civilians and 6 British servicemen. The majority faced summary execution. From the start of the invasion until the 9th of September of 1941, 1,135 Cretans had been executed. Only 224 received even a formal military sentence. The rest died without legal guarantees, under administrative decisions or instant punishments. Meanwhile, German propaganda tried to present an opposite image. Official magazines showed smiling paratroopers with local children, ensuring that no resentments existed in Crete. The reality was different. Hatred toward the occupier had consolidated, and in many places any German symbol was destroyed. Even after the war, machinery used by the invaders was attacked solely for having belonged to the enemy. The island was divided into 2 zones. Germany controlled Chania, Rethymno, and Heraklion, as well as the main ports and cities. Italy received the eastern sectors of Citea and Lasithi under General Angelo Carta's Siena division, headquartered in Neapolis. The Italian administration was much more relaxed and on occasions tolerated hiding places for political fugitives. Numerous wanted individuals found refuge there, far from German rigor. In the German zone, a network of urban garrisons and small rural posts led by non-commissioned officers was established. On the south coast, where clandestine contacts with the British would soon begin, a chain of watchposts was erected to prevent secret landings. Even so, the mountainous regions remained difficult to dominate. German patrols avoided entering certain sectors and fired into bushes before advancing for fear of ambushes. The large cities suffered another form of oppression: hunger, black market, and constant surveillance. The scarcity of leather forced the manufacture of soles from old tires, and getting food was increasingly difficult for those who did not have farming relatives. Even so, corruption appeared among German officers and non-commissioned officers. Some families managed to free detainees by delivering food or favors to intermediaries linked to the occupation. Also, the Jewish community of Crete was struck. About 200 Jews, mostly from Chania and Heraklion, were detained in nocturnal operations, sent to prisons, and embarked toward the mainland. Subsequent reports indicated that a large part died when the ship transporting them was sunk at sea. However, the terror did not destroy the resistance. Monasteries like Prevali helped evacuate men toward Egypt. Entire families hid foreigners, even knowing that the penalty could be death. In towns like Asigonia, future clandestine leaders began to emerge. The island that refused to die. The year 1943 altered the balance of the occupation. After the German defeats at El Alamein and Stalingrad, the Axis command began to fear an Allied landing in Greece or Crete. Since January, they reinforced the island with tanks, motorized transport, and new troops, even though the Russian front claimed men urgently. Lieutenant Taverna, an Italian counterintelligence officer who would later desert to the British, calculated a garrison of 45,000 Germans and 32,000 Italians. The Cretan fortress again became a strategic priority. The Germans ordered the mining of bridges, the expansion of ammunition depots, and the excavation of underground command posts. The defenses of Suda Bay were reinforced again. Several units practiced urban combat with infantry, tanks, and combined artillery. The Askifu garrison was tripled to cover the passes towards Sfakia. Mobile columns rehearsed counterattacks against hypothetical landings. General Bruno Breuer proclaimed that Crete would be defended to the last man and the last bullet. Those slogans did not raise morale. The Central German fear was not just an external invasion, but a Cretan uprising in their rear. British reports sent to Cairo indicated that the occupiers knew perfectly well how much the population hated them. Even so, many soldiers seemed surprised at not being accepted. That contradiction lived alongside abusive requisitions, forced labor, and ridiculous payments. 700 drachmas for a day's work, an amount that was not enough for 2 eggs, and 120 for a cow, barely enough for some cigarettes. The occupation lived off the subjugated country. Animals were requisitioned, sheep were stolen on a large scale, and almost no supplies arrived from Germany. General Friedrich Wilhelm Müller imposed aggressive patrols to intimidate the population. But in the mountains, the opposite occurred. German patrols advanced with fear. In one village, a lieutenant staying in a house blocked the door with a cup and a basin as an improvised alarm. At dawn, he appeared sitting on the bed, clutching his submachine gun, terrified. Searches for weapons intensified. Detachments of 50 men conducted quick searches, while larger operations of between 200 and 500 soldiers surrounded towns during the night and entered at dawn. The population was locked in churches or schools while floors and orchards were dug up. Many raids started from spy reports, although frequently the information arrived late or was imprecise. That inefficiency allowed several clandestine networks to survive. In January of 1943, an incursion in Alonis discovered a radio battery buried in the garden of the priest John Alevizakis, a respected figure of the resistance. The priest fled to the mountains, as did 2 British operators. His son was arrested with compromising letters. Meanwhile, the neighbors quickly hid the charging motor and the rest of the equipment that the Germans had not found in the first inspection. The population learned to react in minutes. A few days later, German troops entered Asigonia looking for George Psychondakis. This time, they brought the informant hidden under a waterproof cape. Another report provoked a large operation in Apokoronis, around Gournes. There, they surrounded a cheese hut called The Hive, abandoned only a day before by Paddy Lee Fermor, Arthur Reed, the operator Alec Tarves, and the guides Yanni Tsangarakis and George Psychondakis. From another mountain, British and Cretans observed about 200 soldiers searching the area. The group decided to split up. Lee Fermor, Reed, and Tsangarakis climbed a large cypress covered in snow and remained hidden in its branches until almost night. The 25th of January was remembered later as Oak Apple Day, alluding to the famous escape of King Charles II of England. In March, a much more serious betrayal arrived. The Germans received notice of a caïque transporting Cretan officers toward the Middle East and intercepted it at sea, sinking it with cannon fire off the southwestern coast. With German morale weakened, Dunbabin, Lee Fermor, and Fielding launched a psychological campaign. They prepared leaflets in German directed at the soldiers' nostalgia and isolation. Some bore fake stamps with Nazi eagles and messages in Greek ordering the paper to be delivered to the first German found. Thus, they ensured its circulation, protected the local population, and ridiculed the officers. Nocturnal graffiti also appeared near barracks and posts. Scheiß Hitler, Heil Stalin, we want to go home, the Führer is a pig. Lee Fermor drafted another threatening proclamation signed by Black Dimitri Archegos of Central Crete, where he warned that Cretan eyes watched every German step, and that revenge was approaching. The occupiers, convinced that they would never win sympathies, tried at least to sow neutrality in the face of an eventual British invasion. Their propaganda attacked London less and concentrated the discourse against the communists. The German command, influenced by Russia, saw in Elas a greater future threat. On the island, the political struggle grew between nationalists and communists. British officers tried to avoid an open rupture between Venezuelist groups and EAMELAS. General Mandakas, the main Cretan military man close to the left, was considered by some British a prudent and ambitious man who believed he could control ELAS. The communists, seeing his limits as a charismatic leader, sought to attract Manoli Banduvas, a popular chief in the Heraklion Mountains and with strong peasant support. Banduvas interested everyone. The British feared the communist advance and tried to pull him away from that influence. They offered him consultations with the Middle East General Headquarters, hoping to take him temporarily out of the leftist environment. He suspected a maneuver and rejected the invitation in public, proclaiming that his place was with his men in the field. The story spread quickly. British generals required him, but he preferred to stay fighting with his compatriots. The British mission insisted and granted him the grandiloquent title of Chief of Francs Tireurs of the province of Heraklion. Banduvas later omitted the provincial part to make it sound pan-Cretan. When King George II sent a greeting to the resistance, promoted from Cairo, Banduvas responded with monarchical enthusiasm, despite being a recent communist hope. He declared that they were united with the king to strike the satanic wolf. Loyalties in Crete changed rapidly. In April, the communists committed their greatest political error. They called a pan-Cretan conference in Karines and invited all groups except the British. Major Christos Tsifakis, hero of Rethymno, withdrew upon discovering the exclusion. Among the proposed resolutions figured one openly anti-British and another where Greece renounced northern Epirus, Thrace, and parts of Macedonia for not being ethnically Greek. Many patriots considered that treason. The meeting ended in scandal. After that failure, the nationalist organization, EOK, held a general meeting on the 15th of June in Prines and appointed political and military leaders for Chania, Rethymno, Heraklion, and Lassithi. In Chania, there existed a clandestine administrative structure formed by people who held official positions under the Germans while secretly helping the Allies. Nikolaos Skoulas, mayor of the city, stood out. Among the youths, Konstantinos Mitsotakis, Manousos Manoussakis, and Mikhaili Botonakis collaborated with Markos Panoudakis' intelligence network. Rethymno had a network organized by Major Tsifakis, who had united Venizelists, monarchists, and communists since 1941, although the latter were marginalized after Karinis. There, one of the best organizational models on the whole island also functioned. The Council of the Amari Valley, nicknamed by the British the Lotusland County Council. Its coordinator was the teacher Alexandros Kokonas, very dear in Yarakari. In Lasithi, Colonel Nikolaos Plevres led forces with numerous veterans of the 5th Cretan Division. But Tom Dunbabin and Sandy Rendell suspected him since he was released quickly by the Germans after a raid in Neapolis. 18 months later, he would receive German weapons to fight communists. In Heraklion, the Committee of Civilian Advisors had been created with ecclesiastical and academic figures. Its military chief, Colonel Betainakis, possessed courage far superior to his judgment. Heraklion's greatest resource was the information network led first by George Doundoulakis and later by Miki Akoumianakis, son of Sir Arthur Evans's foreman in Knossos. Because of this, he received the code name Minoan Mike. The strictly intelligence part passed into the hands of an ISLD mission that arrived on the 12th of May. Ralph Stockbridge, a former operator for Jack Smith Hughes, now a captain, also returned accompanied by John Stanley. Both arrived in the Greek submarine Papanikolis, commanded by Captain Athanasios Spanidis, famous for audacious actions in the Adriatic. Disembarked between Rethymno and Heraklion, too far from the coast, they had to row in a small circular boat that barely advanced. They even carried carrier pigeons. Upon approaching, they saw fishermen and pronounced the agreed password, "We have come for the bees." The men fled, believing they were Germans. Upon touching land, they discovered they had fallen into a minefield. Finally, they found their contact, Paddy Lee Fermor. He led them to the Vosaku Monastery and then to a stone fold of the Dramundanis family on the slopes of Ida above Anoia. There, an evacuation to Egypt was being prepared. On the 25th of May, a tragedy occurred. Upon hearing notice of a German patrol in Anoia, Lee Fermor checked his rifle. He did not see a bullet in the magazine. Upon closing the bolt and pulling the trigger, the weapon fired and wounded Yanni Tsangarakis in the thigh. The wound seemed minor. He was bandaged and they sent to fetch a doctor, but he died shortly after. They buried him under 2 holm oaks, hiding the grave with stones and thorns. Lee Fermor was devastated. Worse still, some people spread that the death had been planned and tried to convince the family. The bitterness lasted years until common friends, especially George Psychondakis, re-established the truth. Decades later, Lee Fermor and his wife Joan would be godparents to a grandniece of Yanni named Joanna. Meanwhile, Petra Kajorgis returned from Cairo on the 7th of June after contacts with the American OSS, which promised weapons and money. None of that materialized. Shortly after, the Germans attacked his band over Voritsia. He escaped with only 7 men after a day-long combat where the attackers lost 13 dead. In reprisal, they expelled the population and destroyed Voritsia with Stuka dive bombers. In the west, Zan Fielding coordinated the final evacuation of Allied stragglers hidden since 1941. New Zealand Sergeant Tom Moya arrived from the MY9 organization in charge of getting fugitives out. He located numerous groups and prepared a maritime shuttle to Egypt. Among the most difficult cases was a paralyzed Australian hidden in a cave in Kyriakoselia. But Moyer was captured on the 6th of May and sent as a prisoner of war to Greece after convincing the Germans that he had never left the island. Fielding assumed the operation and gathered dispersed men in a wooded hideout above Kustoyerako. The evacuation was to take place on the night of the 7th of May. The paralyzed Australian was to go out disguised as an old sick woman on a donkey. At the last moment, he refused to put others at risk, convinced that he would not survive the journey. He died shortly after. The clandestine war was full of dead-end decisions. In June, Schubert, the new chief of counterintelligence, appeared in Kumara accompanied by Cretan collaborators pretending to be British officers. A boy suspected the deception and tried to flee. They captured him and killed him right there. Neighbors came upon hearing the shot, and Schubert escaped before they reacted. At the end of July, George Psychoundakis returned, accompanied by one of the most famous figures of the resistance, Sergeant Dudley Perkins, a New Zealander known as Kiwi to the British and Vasili to the Cretans. A veteran of Galatas and an escapee from a prisoner of camp, he was a natural guerrilla leader, audacious and tactically brilliant. Perkins was sent to Salino, where he worked with Alec Tarvis and trained the Patarakis family band. With fewer than 20 men, he soon formed one of the most effective groups on the island. After a parachute drop, they received Stens, Brens, and Thompsons. The resistance was entering a new armed phase. That same summer, political tensions increased. General Mandakas demanded weapons alleging British recognition of EAM and ELAS. His inner circle pressured Zan Fielding to accept him as leader of all the resistance. But he would only agree if he accepted the Allied chain of command. Mandakas refused, and the dispute remained stalled. The Nazi general who disappeared. At the end of 1943, Sandy Rendell received in the Lassithi Mountains a message sent by Tom Dunbabin. Patrick Lee Fermor would return to Crete by parachute, accompanied by a small team arriving from Brindisi. The mission was extraordinary, even by the standards of clandestine warfare, to capture a German general and take him alive off an island occupied by tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. It was not a matter of sabotage or espionage. It was a direct blow to the prestige of the Reich. The idea was not new. Already in June of 1942, it had been considered to kidnap General Andrei, commander of the fortress of Crete. Andrei had asked Manousos Manousakis to guide him on an ibex hunt through the White Mountains. Manousakis warned Markos Panoudakis, chief of the Quins network, and he spoke of the plan with Zan Fielding. The SOE in Cairo approved the operation, but organizing it proved almost impossible. Furthermore, Jellicoe's attack forced everything to be suspended when Andrei was required in Heraklion to order executions. The proposal was reborn in 1944. After several delays, the drop was set for the night of the 4th of February over the Catharo Plateau. Lee Fermor jumped first. The plane was to turn and return to drop the rest one by one, as the area was too narrow. He would mark the signal with a flashlight from the ground, but the clouds blocked the way. The men below heard the aircraft turn again and again without success until it moved away toward the sea. Lee Fermor hid with Rendell in a cave above Tapais. The following weeks were a chain of confusing messages between Crete and Cairo. 7 drops were cancelled at the last instant. The repeated flights drew German attention. Assuming that a large force had landed, they doubled the Kritsa garrison from 50 to 100 men. There was at least one compensation. 2 German patrols ran into each other at night and shot at each other, leaving dead and wounded. During those days, a traitor hunting squad from Banduvas's band also appeared. They carried with them an informant captured with the old method of the false arrest, using German uniforms and documentation. They requested authorization to execute him. Rendell and Lee Fermor granted it, although they sent their own men to prevent unnecessary cruelties. Throughout the island, collaborators were being hunted. In Mescla, an LS group shot down 8 members of the feared Shubarayos. Shortly after, the Germans dissolved the Jagd Commando Schubert. On the 24th of March, while Rendell was absent, new visitors arrived at the cave. They were 3 communist chiefs already turned into armed leaders: Yanni Bodias in Heraklion, Samaritis in Lassithi, and Mitsos Opapas, famous for having sunk an enemy ship alone. They wanted to discuss the national bands agreement signed in mainland Greece between Elas and Edis. They also demanded weapons. Lee Fermor admitted that the request had foundation and promised to recommend it, although in private he feared a future internal war. Finally, upon abandoning the aerial drop attempts, the rest of the team arrived by sea on the night of the 4th of April in Tsutsuro. A launch left them via auxiliary boat. On the return trip, 4 Luftwaffe deserters and a typist from the German headquarters in Ayerapetra named Antonia embarked, who had delivered decisive information to the resistance. On the beach, Lee Fermor and Rendell waited. The newcomers were Captain William Stanley Moss, a young officer from the Coldstream Guards, Manoli Patarakis, a veteran fighter and former gendarme from Salino, and George Tyrakis, a Cretan from the Amari Valley linked to the SOE since the beginning. Also present were Grigory Kanarakis, who in 1942 had rescued Sergeant Joe Bradley, and Antoni Papaleonidas. Once deep in a safe zone, they sacrificed 2 goats to feed the group. After 17 cumulative months on the island, Lee Fermor felt almost like one more among the Cretans. The Vianos disaster had marked him deeply. He wanted to execute an action without bloodshed that would strike the occupier and, at the same time, unite rival factions. In the operational meeting, he explained that the initial target, General Müller, responsible for numerous atrocities, had been replaced by Major General Heinrich Kreipe, recently arrived from the Russian front. The change did not alter the decision. For the British, any captured general would do. The plan consisted of acting in the relatively open area between the Arcane's headquarters and the official command residence in Knossos, the Villa Ariadne, former archaeological base of John Pendlebury. 2 days after the landing, the group met with Athanasios Bourtzalis, an old Capitan originally from Asia Minor. They evaluated using his Andartes as a covering force if something went wrong. The temporary base was set in Kastamonitsa. Miki Akoumyanakis arrived there from Heraklion by bus. Dressed as a city man among highlanders with boots and baggy trousers, he seemed out of place. However, he was one of the key men. He knew Knossos better than anyone from having been raised there. He had cultivated a friendship with the general's driver, and had even spent a night in the Villa Ariadne. During a reconnaissance, he thoughtlessly offered an English cigarette to a German sergeant and got out of the situation by saying it came from the black market. While the bulk of the group hid in a cave, Lee Fermor and Akoumyanakis studied the route between Arcanes and Knossos. The former preferred to burst inside the villa, but Mickey dissuaded him. Double barbed wire, abundant guards, and closed terrain. During an inspection, they saw Kreipe pass by in an official car. They saluted him on impulse. The general, surprised, returned the gesture. There the final idea was born, to take him in his own automobile. The junction of the Arcanes Road with the Heraklion Castelli Way was chosen as the ambush point. Akoumyanakis set off to get 2 German uniforms for the British. At the same time, Elias Athanasakis, a student in charge of watching the villa, Nikos Komis, Dimitri Tsatsas, and Pavlos Zografistos, owner of a vineyard near the crossroads, joined. Russian prisoners escaped from a labor battalion also appeared, although they were later sent to another hideout. Lee Fermor and Moss decided to ask Bourtzalis for help as an emergency barrier. The veteran arrived with 14 men after a very fast march. However, the operation was postponed twice, and local peasants detected the presence of outsiders, forcing the withdrawal of the auxiliary force. At the last minute, 2 gendarme friends of Lee Fermor joined, Antoni Zoidakis and Stratis Saviolakis. In total, 11 men remained. If a truck full of soldiers appeared, they could barely resist for minutes. For 3 consecutive afternoons, they waited in vain. Kreipe returned too early to the Villa Ariadne. On the 25th of April, it began to rain, and they had to abandon the dry riverbed where they were hiding because neighbors were looking for snails. On the 26th of April, the general did not appear before nightfall. They took benzodrine tablets to stay alert and occupied positions. At 9:30 at night, after several false alarms, the correct headlights arrived. Elias Athanasakis had memorized for days the exact shape of those lights. He gave the signal. Hundreds of meters below, a bell rang connected by cable to where Moss and Lee Fermor waited in German uniform. They stepped out to the center of the road and signaled the car to stop. Each one approached from one side. Lee Fermor shone a light on the occupant and demanded documentation. The driver protested. Moss opened the door and struck him with a flexible baton. From behind, the Cretans dragged him out. On the other side, Lee Fermor pointed his Colt and pulled Kreipe out, while Patarakis and 2 others handcuffed him. Akoumyanakis, overcome by the moment, shouted at the general, "What are you people looking for in Crete?" Everything lasted less than a minute. Moss took the wheel. Kreipe was placed on the rear floor, held by Tyrakis, Patarakis, and Saviolakis. Lee Fermor sat in front with the general's cap. They drove toward Heraklion. Passing in front of the Villa Ariadne, the sentries presented arms to the official car without suspecting anything. Further on, they reached the city controls. "General's wagon!" shouted Lee Fermor from the window. The salutes opened the way, one after another. They also passed the Chania Gate, the most guarded. Once on the Rethymno Road, near Yenigave, they abandoned the vehicle and split up. Moss marched on foot with the prisoner toward Anoia. Lee Fermor continued with Tirakis to leave the automobile near the coast and simulate an immediate extraction by submarine. On the front seat, they left a letter to the German command stating that the action had been organized entirely from Egypt without local participation to prevent reprisals. Then began the hardest part, crossing Crete with a captive general while thousands of soldiers looked for him. Fieseler Storch planes flew over the Ida dropping pamphlets that threatened to destroy entire towns if Kripa was not delivered. However, villagers and guerrillas kept silence. Hundreds knew his whereabouts, and no spy managed to sell the news. There were enemy cordons, changes of route, continuous rains, and exhausting days. Kripa fell from a mule down a rocky slope and injured his shoulder. For days they advanced from shelter to shelter toward the west. Finally, the evacuation was coordinated at a beach near Rodakino. On the night of the 14th of May, a launch responded to the Morse signal from land. The covering group landed expecting combat, but found a crowd of Andartes gathered to see off the party. Before embarking, the men left boots, surplus weapons, and rations for those remaining on the beach. Kripa entered captivity with increasing composure. Lee Fermor, instead, arrived in Cairo sick and exhausted. Militarily, the capture did not alter the course of the war, but it destroyed the image of absolute control that Germany claimed to have over the island. It raised Cretan morale and left the occupier in ridicule before Europe. Those who never returned. 3 days before the Allied landing in Normandy, a small mission from the Organization of Strategic Services, the American equivalent of the SOE, arrived in Crete on the same vessel that transported Lieutenant Hugh Fraser of the 7th Hussars. The group, led by Colonel McGlasson, was to collect political and military information. He claimed autonomy from the British and remained for a few weeks at the western end of the island. Shortly after another American landed, Major Bill Royce. From then on, the clandestine structure was renamed the Allied Military Mission. The summer of 1944 brought new incursions from the Special Boat Squadron. Sandy Rendell received notice in June to assist a force that would arrive by sea. Unlike previous operations, the main objective would not be airfields, but fuel depots. The intention was to force the Germans, already short of fuel, to send a tanker vulnerable to Allied submarines. The attacks were to coincide with simultaneous actions in mainland Greece. At the beginning of July, the SBS advance guard arrived under the command of Ian Patterson. They found not only Rendell, but a crowd of Cretan helpers with 23 mules ready to transport material. The British never got used to the local disregard for security rules. 10 days later, the bulk of the force landed, and the team set off toward Castelli, Heraklion, Neapolis, and Armenoi. The group destined for Armenoi, led by Dick Hardman and guided by Hugh Fraser and George Psychondakis, received false data from an informant named Sarudakis, who ensured that the fuel had been withdrawn. To avoid problems with the occupiers, he had deceived them. With no depot to destroy, they blew up a bridge near Kupi and ambushed a truck, killing 5 soldiers. Fraser left a note and British equipment to attribute the action only to foreign commandos and avoid punishments on civilians. That same night, the 22nd of July, other operations expanded the impact. Mikhaili Zilouris, a firmly pro-British Capitan of the Anoia region, attacked a post near Daphnis with an inexperienced band and managed to kill 15 Germans. Altogether, the actions destroyed about 165,000 gallons of fuel. 2 members of the SBS were captured, John Lodwick and Bombardier Nixon. Both would escape later when Yugoslav partisans assaulted the train taking them to Germany. With Soviet victories in the east and the opening of the Normandy front, the Cretan resistance grew rapidly. Bands in the mountains and reservists in the cities increased in number. Many wanted to appear as resistors before the war ended. Tensions also grew between EOK, nationalist, and ELAS, dominated by communists. Both sides watched each other with distrust, while the British tried to avoid an internal war. The insurrectionary impulse soon led to brutal reprisals. On the 7th of August, Feldwebel Ollenhauer went up from Yenigave to Anoia with 7 men to recruit labor by force. He detained neighbors, women, and children and began to march them toward Rethymno. 7 ELS reservists, joined by 5 locals, ambushed the column. They captured Olenhauer, his men, and even his dog. Later, they executed them all. The inhabitants of Anoia knew what would come. They abandoned houses, hid belongings, and took up ancient weapons. Billy Moss decided to attack the German column that would inevitably come. He gathered his men, several escaped Russians, and Zyluris's fighters. They chose a curve near Damastas and mined a small bridge with Hawkins grenades. The ambush degenerated into chaos. They had to push aside herds, fired on the wrong vehicles, and pursued occupants across fields. Finally, the true German force appeared. A truck with infantry and an armored car. 15 Sten submachine guns annihilated the first group. The armored car shot down a guide from Anoia and a Russian. Moss managed to climb up from behind and threw a grenade through the hatch. About 30 soldiers died, including prisoners finished off afterward. The victory did not save Anoia. 5 days later, the Germans gathered larger forces and issued a proclamation signed by Müller on the 13th of August of 1944. They accused the town of British espionage, of the murder of the Yenigeve sergeant, of the sabotage in Damastas, of protecting Andartes, and of having served as a stopover in the kidnapping of Kripe. They ordered the locality to be razed and to execute every male found in the town or within a radius of 1 kilometer. Most of Anoia was burned. 30 inhabitants were shot, and another 15 men died in the vicinity. That same day, Tom Dunbabin and Antoni Zoidakis were crossing the Armenoi-Rethymno road when 2 Germans opened fire without warning. Zoidakis fell wounded. Dunbabin shot one and hit the other, but enemy reinforcements arrived. They captured Zoidakis, tied him to a vehicle, and dragged him until he was dead. His corpse remained exposed for several days as a warning. 5 days after a failed conference between nationalists and communists in Melidoni, another phase of terror began. Between the 22nd and the 30th of August, several German battalions penetrated the Amari Valley. The inhabitants were completely surprised. 9 villages were destroyed. 164 civilians died by shooting. Yerakari alone lost 43 neighbors. The houses were looted, loaded onto trucks heading for Rethymno, and then burned. Livestock was requisitioned. The local bands could barely respond. The magnitude of the German force made any serious attempt at intervention suicidal. Some minor combats cost 12 German lives in the last days of the operation, but did not alter the result. Several villages were razed without explanation, and others remained intact by arbitrary decisions. Asigonia, despite being a resistance center, escaped. Many attributed it to the protection of St. George. In September, the German withdrawal from outer posts toward the west of the island began. Cairo ordered the cessation of sabotages that would endanger the population. Not everyone obeyed. On the 11th of September, an ELAS unit took the agricultural post of Asamatan without blood. Hours later, nationalists forced the release of the prisoners and the withdrawal. The incident triggered new clashes in Apostoloi when guerrillas attacked 2 military trucks. The Germans responded with reinforcements and field artillery. They bombarded the Amari Valley and Pandanasa. A projectile killed Dr. Stavroulakis while he was attending to German wounded. The figures spread by the Andartes were exaggerated, but there were deaths and new prisoners executed. Days later, Zyluris's group eliminated a patrol of 14 men near Silariti. However, the German command avoided new, massive reprisals. The morale of its troops was collapsing. Desertions multiplied. Of 500 prisoners in the Aya jail, about 150 were Italians and another 150 Germans. The rest included punished Russians. Many soldiers feared the war as much as falling into Cretan hands. The memory of collaborators and previous deceptions had hardened local conduct against genuine deserters. On the 11th of October, the liberation of Heraklion arrived. For 10 days, both sides watched each other armed. The Germans could still bombard the city. Finally, they withdrew without fighting. Bill Royce and Sandy Rendell appeared in uniform near the new gate. Elas arrived with Yanni Bodias, mounted on a pony adorned with daisies. Petra Kajorgis entered in a captured German vehicle. When the last convoy left through the Chania gate, The crowd erupted in songs and cheers. The joy soon turned into revenge. Punishment for collaborators was demanded. There were lootings, threats, and clashes between factions. British officers had to impose calm in the city. On the 13th of October, the last German troops abandoned Rethymno, heading for Chania. There, a fortified pocket remained in the west of the island, where thousands of Axis soldiers remained surrounded for months. On the 8th of May of 1945, the final message arrived: unconditional surrender. The following day, the capitulation was signed in Heraklion. A few days later, the German troops were disarmed while waiting for embarkation at Suda Bay. Many Cretans resented seeing those who had occupied the island depart alive. Then another task began: rebuilding and searching for the disappeared. Under burned villages, ravines, improvised graves, and retreat roads remained hundreds of nameless victims. Other thousands never returned from prisons, executions, or combat. The memory remained fragmented between World War, Civil War, and subsequent silence. On an island famous for beaches and tourism, under the earth, thousands of Hitler's dead remain buried.